The first thing I heard was her voice. Not her words, the stone swallowed those. Only the shape of it, low and unhurried, drifting up through the tower floor like warm smoke through a cold grate. I was seated on the flagstones where my great wolf had left me, my back against the far wall, the iron cressets burned down to nothing. I had not asked them to be lit. I did not know if it was day or night. I had stopped knowing that some weeks ago. All I knew was the roaring, the endless, hollow roaring inside my own chest where Aldrich lived, where he had lived since the night I lost Myra, and where he had been raging ever since. 7 years of it. I had tried every remedy the North could offer. I had sent for healers from the coast, from the mountain settlements, from the southern courts. They came up the tower stairs with their oils and their prayers and their careful faces. Aldrich smelled their fear before they reached the landing, and then they fled, everyone, and I let them. I was tired of asking. So when Lord Castle's message arrived, soft-footed, delivered by his youngest page, pressed into my steward Brennan's hand with the particular careful courtesy Lord Castle used when he wanted something, I did not read it for 2 days. It lay on the floor beside the cold hearth. The great wolf circled it once, huffed, lay down. I watched the page boy's boots disappear down the outer stair, and I did not call him back. On the 3rd day, I read it. Lord Castle, first advisor of the Southern Realm, wrote that the celebrated Alpha King of Calder Reach had lately employed a healer from the border villages, a woman of quiet reputation and some noted ability with wolf bonds, and that said king was minded to lend her services to the North if I would agree to receive her. The letter was gracious and elaborate, as Castle's letters always were. Between each elegant sentence I could read what it did not say, that Castle had engineered this. That the Alpha King of Calder Reach, young and golden and adored by his own court, had agreed because Castle had likely told him it was wise to extend the hand of fellowship northward. That the healer herself probably knew very little about any of it. I sat with the letter until Aldrich pressed his great dark head against my knee. He did not urge anything. He was simply there, the way he always was in the quieter hours. 7 years old in his grief and still the largest wolf in the North, still mine. I wrote back one line, "She may come." I did not expect her to arrive in a driving sleet storm. I did not expect anything. But Brennan told me afterward that the carriage from the south had broken a wheel on the Ironspire Road in the worst sleet the pass had seen in a decade, and that she had walked the last 2 miles with her traveling case in one hand and her hood soaked through, and that she had arrived at the lower gate and asked for a place to dry her things before she even asked to see the king. Brennan had stared at her. She had looked up at the tower and then back at him, with the particular steady patience of someone who has been walking in bad weather and considers herself fortunate to have arrived at all. He gave her the lower hearth room. I heard all of this from Brennan the following morning. I had not gone down. I had no intention of going down. She was here. That was the agreement. Let her rest. Let her take her measure of the place. Every healer who had come before her had needed a night at least before they found the courage to climb the stairs. I gave her 2 days. I counted them in Aldrich's slow breathing and the sleet tapping the high window. On the 2nd morning she knocked. Not on the tower's lower door, where the previous healers had gathered their courage and their herb cases and their careful expressions. She knocked on the tower door at the very top, the landing outside the room where I kept most to. I had not heard her on the stairs. That alone was unusual. The tower stairs had a particular groan to them, a sequence I knew in the dark, and she had not triggered a single one. I stood. Aldrich raised his head. The knock came again, 3 quiet raps, unhurried, not timid but not demanding either. The knock of someone who has walked a long way and is comfortable waiting. I crossed to the door and opened it. She was standing with her back half-turned, looking out through the narrow slit window that faced north, at the iron-gray sky and the snow-draped shoulder of the mountain range. She had not expected me to answer so quickly. I could tell by the slight turn of her head, the breath she drew. But she did not startle. She completed her look at the mountains and then faced me, and that was when I first saw her clearly. She was not what any of them had described. Lord Castle's letter had said only a healer of some repute from the border country, a phrase that told me nothing. Brennan had called her quietly spoken and not very grand. The court of Calder Reach, I learned later, had marked her as plain. The steward there had written her off as a hill country herbwoman in an unfashionable traveling coat the first morning she arrived in the South. Before the Alpha Kings, Master Healer had taken one look at her work with a badly wolf-bitten stable hand and revised that opinion sharply. None of that was in the letter. What I saw was this: a woman of steady dark eyes and a composed, unhurried face, wearing a coat that had dried unevenly from the sleet and still bore a faint waterline near the hem. Her hair was pinned back with the kind of ruthless practicality of someone who does not think about her hair because her hands are usually occupied with something more pressing. She was carrying nothing, no herb case, no oils, no tray of remedies. She had come to the door with only herself. She met my eyes and she did not look away. I cannot tell you what that was worth to me. 7 years of people who looked away, who looked at the floor or at Aldrich, or at some point on the wall behind my shoulder, anything rather than hold my gaze for longer than a breath. She simply looked at me, the way you look at a window or a door or anything that simply is what it is. I thought I should come up rather than wait, she said. Her voice was the same as I had heard through the stone, low, unhurried. I am Senna. I came from Willowfen by way of Calder Reach. I stepped back from the door. She came in. Aldrich was on his feet. He was always on his feet when a stranger entered. 7 years of loss had made him watchful and close, and I had learned not to apologize for it. He stood at the far side of the room and regarded her from that height and breadth that still made trained soldiers step back without meaning to. He was the largest wolf in the north, had been since his 2nd year, when he had outgrown every other wolf in the pack by a full hand's breadth at the shoulder. And 7 years of confinement and grief had put a particular weight in him, a coiled and watchful silence that was not stillness exactly, but a thing on the edge of stillness, the way ice looks still above fast water. I watched her see him. I watched her take the measure of him, his dark pelt, the silver threading his muzzle that had come these last 2 years, the particular stillness he held that meant he had not yet decided anything. She did not step back. She did not step forward either. She simply stopped where she was and let him look, the same way she had let me look, as if she understood that she was a new thing in a space that had learned to be careful of new things, and that the right courtesy was patience, not performance. Most people's first instinct when Aldrich looked at them was to fill the silence, to speak, to move, to do something to manage the discomfort of being assessed. She did none of those things. She stood in her unevenly dried coat and regarded my great wolf with the calm of a woman who has looked at large, frightened things before, and understood that what they need first is to be allowed to look. Aldrich breathed. It was a single long breath, slow out through his nostrils, the kind of breath that meant nothing in particular and yet meant everything. The kind of breath I had not heard from him since Myra. He had been holding himself tight for so long that I had almost forgotten the sound of him releasing. Something happened in my chest, not a sound exactly, a settling like a stone finding the floor of a deep river and resting there, so sudden and so quiet that I almost missed it. I had been carrying a roaring thing inside me for 7 years, and in the space of one exhaled breath it simply paused, not ended, not healed, paused, like a bell that had been ringing too long suddenly held. I said nothing. Senna turned from Aldrich and looked at me. "Has he been eating?" she asked. I blinked. The wolf. "Yes." I told her, erratically, which was true. Aldrich had never returned to his old appetites after Myra died. I had learned to watch for the days he refused entirely and read them as a kind of weather forecast for my own moods. If he refused the morning, I would find the day dark and close. If he ate with something approaching his old interest, I could usually manage the afternoon. I had not told anyone this before. I told her because she asked directly and because direct questions from this woman, I was already discovering, had a way of arriving before my defenses did. She asked 3 more questions, practical questions, about his patterns of sleep, about whether the restlessness was worse at certain hours, about the tower's cold and whether I had tried moving him to a lower room. No one had ever asked about the lower room. I told her I had not tried it. Aldrich had chosen the tower himself on the 3rd night after Myra, and I had followed him up and not come down, and it had not occurred to me to question it since. She nodded, as though this was useful information and not a thing anyone might find strange, and turned back to Aldrich. "I am going to sit down on the floor," she said plainly, and she did. She folded down onto the flagstones at a middle distance from him, not crowding, not retreating, and settled her coat around her and was still. I watched from the doorway, not entering fully. Aldrich watched her for a long moment, that slow, measuring look that I knew took in more than sight. Then he lowered himself back to the floor, facing her, and put his chin on his forepaws. That was the first morning. She came up each day after that. She did not bring remedies, which puzzled me and which I did not ask about for the first several days, though I watched for them, expecting the herb pouches and the careful oils and the things the other healers had unpacked before they fled. She brought nothing but a small lamp when the daylight was thin, and she sat on the floor, and sometimes she spoke, quietly, not to me or to anyone in particular, simply into the room the way you might hum a low note to yourself without thinking, and sometimes she sat without speaking at all, and Aldrich slowly over those days moved closer. There was a particular afternoon, the 3rd day, when I sat at the narrow window with my back to the room and listened to her not quite speaking, the low and occasional murmur of it, and I realized that she was talking to him. Not instructions, not the practiced soothing phrases the previous healers had used, which Aldrich had always heard as what they were, performance, a voice doing a task. She was simply talking, describing, in that low, unhurried tone, a river she had once crossed in early spring flood, the color of the water and the cold weight of it around her knees, and the way the rocks felt underfoot when you could not see them. I do not know why she was telling him about a river. I know that he lay with his ears turned toward her, and that I sat at the window and listened too, and that the afternoon passed more gently than most afternoons had in years. On the 4th day, he put his nose against her knee. I watched from across the room and felt something I had not felt in years. I had no name for it immediately. It was not exactly hope. It was the feeling just before hope, the moment before you allow yourself to believe that a thing might be possible, that tender, almost frightened feeling of a door not yet opened, but sensed to be there. I came and sat on the floor on the other side of Aldrich that evening, the first time I had sat on the floor since I had stopped being able to stand long enough to care about chairs. We sat on either side of him, the wolf between us, and neither of us spoke for a long time. The amber lamp threw its warm light against the stone wall. Outside the high window, the wind had dropped. It was one of those still northern evenings when the cold simply settles, absolute and quiet, and the mountain range holds its breath. "Tell me about him," she said finally. "Aldrich. Tell me what he was like before." No one had asked me that either. They had asked what was wrong with him, what the curse was, what I had tried, what signs I had observed. They had asked about his appetite, his restlessness, his silence, the roaring that came through the bond when I did not manage it carefully enough. They catalogued the illness. No one had asked what the thing looked like when it was well. I told her. I began with small things, the particular way Aldrich had of greeting me at morning, a headbutt to the shoulder, blunt and certain, the way of a wolf who considers formality unnecessary between people who have shared a bond since boyhood. The way he had of announcing himself to the court, a measured pace through the great hall that I had spent years learning to read as his gauge of the room's mood. A slow pace meant he found the assembled company dull. A faster one meant something in the room interested him, and the few times he had walked in and stopped entirely, head up, I had learned to follow that attention and invariably found it worth following. I told her about the years before the grief, years when Aldrich had run the mountain passes freely, when he had been known to escort travelers. He judged poorly prepared for the northern weather all the way to the Hold Gate, and then sit on the road looking after them with a patience that bordered on moral judgment. I told her about the spring he had decided, for reasons known only to himself, to supervise the rebuilding of the East Wing storage rooms, and had stationed himself in the doorway each morning to inspect the progress, and had twice clearly objected to the placement of a support beam in a way that the head carpenter eventually took seriously, and had been vindicated. I talked for longer than I intended. She listened with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything, and Aldrich dozed between us, and the lamp burned low, and I did not notice the time until the fire had settled to coals. When I ran out of words, she said quietly, "He has not lost any of that. He is still all of that. He is only waiting." "For what?" She looked at me across the wolf's wide back. Her eyes were steady in the lamplight, the same eyes, the same steadiness, not soft exactly but warm in the way of a deep well that holds its warmth because it holds it deep. "For you to believe it too." I sat with that for a long time after she left. The following evening she came up later than usual, and she came with a question. "How long were you bonded with her, Myra?" I looked at her. She had not mentioned Myra before. I had not spoken of her. She must have learned the name from Brennan, or from one of the settlement lords whose passing correspondence had reached her somehow. The name did not sting the way it once had. It had been 7 years. The sharp edges of it had worn to something more like the memory of sharpness, present but not cutting. 11 years, I said. She nodded, turning the small amber lamp slightly, adjusting its angle without seeming to think about it, the gesture of someone accustomed to working by lamplight and accustomed to managing the quality of it. Was the bond mark there from the beginning, between you?" "Yes, we were young." A pause. "I had never known anyone whose mark matched mine. When I saw it, it seemed like certainty. It was certainty. I am not certain I knew then what certainty required of a person over years." She was quiet, looking at the lamp. "The bond does not end when a mate dies," I said. "That is the part the stories do not prepare you for. It does not end, it becomes something else, something without direction, a sound with no source." I stopped. I had never said this to anyone, not in these words. Aldrich felt it too, which is why he could not settle. He grieved in my grief, and my grief had nowhere to go, so it became the roaring, and the roaring became everything. She looked up from the lamp. "Yes," she said simply. Nothing more. Just that one word, which was not sympathy or analysis but acknowledgement. She had heard it, and she said it alongside her understanding of Aldrich, and I could feel her doing so, the way you can feel a weight being redistributed in a room. "Is that what you were waiting for?" I said. "Before you brought anything to the tower, you wanted to know what it was first." "I am not sure bringing things would have helped," she said. "I have sat with enough wolves to know that what they need is not usually a remedy. Usually what they need is for someone to be willing to stay until the thing is named." I said, "And what do you do once the thing is named?" She looked at me across Aldrich's back, and the steadiness in her eyes had something else in it now, something that was not quite a smile but was its near neighbor. "Usually," she said, "the naming is most of it." I sat with that for a long time after she left. Lord Castle arrived on the 12th day. I had known he would come. The message from his office had reached Brennan 3 days before, a note indicating that his lordship was traveling through the north on matters of regional council and would be pleased to call upon the Lycan king's hospitality, a sentence so framed that it could not be declined without open rudeness. Castle was clever about these things. He had been first advisor to the previous king of the southern realm, and he remained now, the hinge on which the southern court turned. The man who had suggested lending a border healer northward, I understood now, not out of any concern for my well-being, but because having his hand in both courts suited him better than having it in only one. I received him in the lower hall. He was a tall man of perhaps 50 years, silver-haired and very well dressed, with a manner of warm reasonableness that I had long ago learned to read as armor. He congratulated me on the improvement in my disposition. He had heard from Brennan, he said, that things were showing signs of progress, and asked after the healer with a proprietary warmth, as if she were a gift he was checking the condition of. "She is well," I said. "Excellent, the Alpha King will be pleased to hear it. He was most concerned. He took quite an interest in her welfare, as you might imagine. She was, for a time, very warmly regarded at Calder Reach." He watched my face as he said it, the way Castle always watched for the thing that his words might shake loose. I said nothing. "A fine young woman," Castle continued, pleasantly. "Remarkable talent, of course, but I refer to her character, that steadiness, that quiet quality, quite distinctive. The Alpha King found her, shall we say, singular. He would not have parted with her services lightly had I not argued the matter at some length with him on your behalf." He paused to let that land. "He may yet find occasion to visit the north to see how his offering has fared." After Castle left, I stood at the lower window for a while, watching the sleet come in off the mountains. Aldrich found me there and pressed his head against my arm, and I put my hand in the thick fur of his ruff, and I tried to examine what was sitting uncomfortably in my chest. I had known since she walked in that she was not mine. She had come here on loan from a southern court, arranged by a man who thought in terms of political assets. She was free, she could leave whenever she chose, and I had no claim on her and no intention of making one. But Aldrich had not left her side in 2 days. But the roaring in my chest had been, in her presence, not silence exactly, but a vast and unprecedented quietness, the way a storm stills before you understand that the storm has passed. But I had talked to her, the previous evening, and the one before, in a way I had not talked to any living soul since Myra died. In a way, if I was honest with myself in the way that dark towers eventually demand a man be, that I had perhaps never talked to Myra either, who had been gentle and good, and whom I had loved in the way of a young king who does not know yet what love requires. Senna listened as though the things I said were worth hearing, and replied as though she had actually thought about them, and that was, I had not known how rare that was until I had gone 7 years without it. I did not say any of this to Castle. What I said to Senna the following morning when she came up the tower stairs, which she now climbed without waking a single groan, a thing that still quietly astonished me, was nothing. I watched her settle beside Aldrich. I watched Aldrich arrange himself with his head in her lap with the ease of an old habit, which at 12 days was nearly what it was. I sat across from them, and I told her about Lord Castle's visit, and she listened. "He intimated the Alpha King might come to visit," I said. "I know. You know. Lord Castle sent a note to the lower room as well." She did not look up from Aldrich. "He is very thorough." "Are you—" I stopped. I was not sure what I was asking. She looked at me then. "Am I going back with him when he comes?" I said nothing, which was as honest an answer as I had. "The Alpha King is kind," she said after a moment. "He was generous to me, and his court is warm and well run. Lord Castle's note says the king is coming to take stock of the arrangement, and those are Lord Castle's words to confirm the loan's terms." She paused. "I am not alone." "No," I said, "you are not." She nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something she had already known but needed to hear aloud. The next morning, Aldrich did something he had not done in 7 years. He stood at the top of the tower stairs and looked down them, looked at the lower door that opened onto the courtyard, and then looked back at me. It was the look he used to give me in the old days when he thought we should run, when the need to move was in him like weather. I had not seen that look since Myra. I looked at him for a long time. Then I walked down the stairs and opened the lower door, and Aldrich walked out into the courtyard and raised his nose to the cold morning air, and stood there with the wind in his fur. And I stood in the doorway and watched him and felt something in my chest that was so large and so unexpected that I had to put my hand against the door frame to be steady. Senna was at the far end of the courtyard with her traveling coat buttoned against the cold, looking up at the mountains. She heard the door and turned. She saw Aldrich in the courtyard, saw it for what it was, and she did not move, did not speak. Let the moment be what it was. I stood in the doorway. Aldrich walked to her and sat beside her, and the two of them looked up at the mountains together, and I do not have words for what that was. I can only say that I had spent 7 years forgetting what the air tasted like outside the tower, and in that moment it tasted of cold stone and pine resin and the first edge of snow, and it was the most alive I had felt since the night I carried Myra home. I stepped out of the doorway. The courtyard stones were cold through my boots, the cold pressing upward through the leather, and I had forgotten that, too, the simple physical weight of the world outside, the way cold presses up and wind presses in, and the sky spreads wider than any tower ceiling can suggest. I walked to where they stood. Aldrich looked at me with those pale eyes and moved slightly, not away, just enough to make room, and I stood on Senna's other side with the mountains in front of us, and the hold behind us, and the sky running gray and enormous overhead. None of us spoke. It seemed the right thing was not to speak. The cold came in off the pass in slow, wide pulses, and somewhere above the clouds the sun was making a thin, bright effort, and the mountain range held its white silence, and Aldrich breathed. I thought, when he is next, he will run the pass again. He will go to the high places. He will be again what he was before. And I stood in the courtyard in the cold with that thought and let it be as large as it was. The Alpha King of Calder Reach arrived 4 days later with a modest retinue, a sign of genuine discretion, not performance. I noted it. He was younger than I expected, with the open and easy manner of a man who has never had cause to doubt that rooms will warm to him when he enters, which they do. He was not a fool. He had a quick intelligence behind the warmth, and he looked at me with the frank assessment of one king measuring another. We met in the lower hall, Brennan standing respectfully at the side. Castle was there, pleased with himself in the contained way of a man who has arranged things to his satisfaction. The Alpha King greeted me with good-natured formality and asked with genuine directness how things stood. "Better," I said. "The work has been real." He nodded, satisfied. Then he said, "And Senna," with a lightness in his voice that was not quite casual enough. I understood then what Castle had done, or tried to do. He had sent a healer north as a gesture of fellowship, yes, but he had calculated that the celebrated Southern king might follow her, that 2 kings meeting over a woman of quality would bind courts more firmly than any treaty, and that he, Castle, would be the architect of the binding. It was the kind of long, intricate arrangement that required everyone to behave as Castle expected. Senna had declined to behave as Castle expected. She came into the hall mid-morning, without ceremony. She came from the direction of the courtyard, which meant she had been out with Aldrich again, and there was a thread of wolf fur on her coat, and she had the particular look of someone who has been thinking hard in cold air. She stopped when she saw the assembled company. She looked at the Alpha King, and her face was kind and clear. She looked at Lord Castle, and her face was the same, which told me she had already understood Castle entirely. She looked at me, and something in her face changed, not much, a steadying, a recognition, the look of someone arriving at the answer to a long question. She bowed to the Alpha King with quiet respect. "It is good to see you well," she said. "And you," he said, and I heard in his voice the recognition of a man who has seen enough of the world to read what is in front of him. He looked at me. He looked at her. He looked at Aldrich, who had come in behind her and who had stopped beside her in that easy way of a wolf who considers himself already home. The Alpha King was quiet for a moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "I see." Castle stepped forward, perhaps a word on the arrangement. "There is no arrangement," the Alpha King said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who does not need to raise his voice to close a door. He looked at Castle with the kind of pleasant but absolute authority that reminded me he had been a king since he was 17 years old and had not survived Castle's counsel all these years by being slow. "Senna came as a healer. She has healed. What comes next is not ours to arrange." He said this last sentence to the room in general, and it landed on Castle with the politeness of a very heavy thing set down carefully. Castle's expression did not change. He was too accomplished for that. But his hands at his sides went very still. I walked across the hall and stood beside Senna. That was all. I did not touch her. I did not claim anything that had not yet been offered. I simply stood beside her, the way Aldrich stood beside her, with the understanding that there was nowhere else I had any interest in being. She looked up at me. Her eyes were the same as they had always been, steady, unafraid, seeing me the way she had seen me from the first morning at the tower door, as simply what I was. But there was something in them now that had not been there then, or perhaps that I had not been able to see then. A recognition not of who I was but of something between us, a thread that had been drawing tighter over 12 days of sitting on stone floors with a wolf between us, and had now, in this moment, become something that could not be unfelt. I had been a king who knew the language of bonds from birth. I had first felt Aldrich's bond as a boy, a warmth behind my ribs that expanded outward into the world like a second breath. I knew that feeling. This was not the same. This was different in the way that sound differs from silence, not better, not worse, but entirely its own thing. It began at my left wrist. I looked down. There on the inside of my wrist, where the skin ran thin over the pulse point, a spiral of pale silver was rising, faint at first, barely visible against the cold flushed skin, and then brighter, and then the color of winter moonlight on new ice, certain and unmistakable. A mark I had been born with the potential for, that I had never expected to see completed, that required the presence of one specific soul in all the world to illuminate. I looked at Senna's wrist. The same spiral, a mirror of mine, silver bright on her skin. She had not had it when she came, I was certain of that. I would have seen it when she first stood in the doorway in the tower, in the clear lamplight, because the lamplight showed everything clearly and I had looked at her clearly. This was new. This was right now. I looked at mine again. The spiral moved, or seemed to. It did not move exactly, but it breathed, the way a flame breathes. It held its light as a living thing holds warmth from inside. I have known the language of bonds from birth. My father taught me early to understand that the bond mark of the Lycan line was not a decoration or a ceremony or a thing that could be manufactured by proximity or will. It was recognition. The oldest magic in the wolf world, older than any hold or kingdom, older than the first king who shaped the pack laws, the recognition that said, "Here, this one." The soul that completes the circuit the other was built around. It could not be hurried, could not be forced, could not be faked. Most Lycan kings never saw it complete. My father had. His father had not. I had resigned myself in the years after Myra, not bitterly, just honestly, the way you resign yourself to weather, to the possibility that I would not. I had been wrong. I knew what it meant, and it stilled me completely. She had gone very still, not with fear, not even with surprise exactly, though her breath had changed. With the stillness of someone receiving news they have been half expecting and not quite daring to believe. "Senna," I said, and my voice was different, quieter than I intended, the voice of a man, not a king, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had said in 7 years. She turned her wrist and looked at the mark. Then she looked at Aldrich. The great dark wolf was on his feet, watching her with those pale eyes, and his tail, which had not moved with ease in 7 years, was moving, slow and certain, back and forth. Something cracked open in my chest, not painfully, the way a seed cracks, the first break that precedes growing. "This is what you came here for," she said softly. It was not a question. "I did not know," I said. "I only knew that I was very tired and that every healer had gone away." "And I did not." "No," I said, "you did not." She was quiet for a moment. Around us the hall had gone very still, Brennan at his post, the Alpha King's small retinue watching with the particular arrested attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that is not their story. The Alpha King himself standing with his arms loose at his sides, and an expression that was thoughtful and generous in equal measure. Castle alone wore the look of a man watching his elaborate arrangement arrive at a conclusion he had not planned for, though it was, by any measure, a better one. Senna said, "I should tell you something." "Tell me." "I knew about the mark before I came. Not about you, not specifically, not your name or your tower. But the moonseer in Willowfen told me when I was young that I carried half a bond mark and that I would know when it completed itself. She said I would know it by a silence." She paused. "When I walked up your tower stairs for the first time, I heard it." I looked at her. "The silence," she said. 7 years of noise in you, and in the moment I reached the landing, quiet. I could feel it from outside the door. I did not know if you could." "Not then," I said. "Later." "Yes." I said, "It is why you were not afraid." "I was not afraid because I have spent a long time learning not to be afraid of things that are mine to tend," she said plainly. But the silence helped. Aldrich put his head against her hip. The Alpha King cleared his throat gently. I looked at him across the hall. "I will take the question of the arrangement up with Lord Castle," he said pleasantly, and that pleasantness had the weight of a door being closed, "and I will ask him to explain to me precisely what he thought he was arranging." He looked at Castle, who maintained his composure with the skill of long practice. "But for now, I think the important things have been settled without him." Castle inclined his head. He was too experienced to fight what had already happened. He simply filed it away, I could tell, as information to be used later. Castle was always filing things away. "Your hospitality has been more than adequate," the Alpha King said to me, warmly and without irony, and I believed him. He was not a small man. He had come here with a hope, perhaps, though a measured one, and it had not resolved as he might have wished, and he was handling that with more grace than many kings would. The North has a better king than it knows. "The South has a good one," I said and meant it. He nodded. He looked at Senna once more, not with longing exactly, but with the particular look of a man saying a genuine farewell to a possibility. "Take care," he told her. "And you," she said. He and his retinue departed the following morning. Castle went with them. The tower was quiet after they left, not the old silence, not the held-breath quiet of a place bracing against the next disturbance. Just quiet, the particular peace of a house that knows its tenants. I found Senna in the courtyard late that afternoon, looking out at the mountains. Aldrich was beside her, and the late light was coming in low across the northern range. That particular pale gold light the north does in early winter when the angle is right, not warm, but honest, the light of things made clear. I stood beside her. "You do not have to stay," I said. "The mark, it does not require anything. It is yours to answer as you choose." I had spent part of the night working out how to say this, and I said it badly, which I suspected but was uncertain how to improve on. She was quiet for a moment. "When I was at Calder Reach," she said, "the court steward wrote me off the morning I arrived. He had me catalogued as a hill country herbwoman before I had taken my coat off." The Alpha King did not notice, or did not correct it, not until his master healer intervened. Brennan told me you walked 2 miles in the sleet to reach this gate and asked for a place to dry your things before you asked to see me, I said. He found it remarkable. I found it practical. A pause. But that is the difference, I think. Some places notice what is practical. Some places catalog what is grand. She looked at the mountain range. I have never wanted to be catalogued. I looked at her profile in the low winter light. The north is cold, I said. The tower is full of drafts and aldrich sheds. I know, I have been here 3 weeks. There is no great court, no warmth in the mornings, no celebrations. There are mountains, she said. Yes. And there is aldrich. Yes. She turned and looked at me. The silver spiral on her wrist caught the low light and held it. And there is you, she said simply, in the same voice she used for everything. The voice that made complicated things feel like the shape they actually were, without the weight of decoration. I looked at the mark on her wrist. I looked at mine. You heard the silence on the landing, I said. Yes. Then you know what it costs me to ask, and not command. I know, she said quietly. I know how much it costs you. I said, will you stay? The mountain wind moved between us, carrying the first edge of that evening's snow. She pulled her coat a little tighter, a small practical gesture, the gesture of a woman who has been cold before and knows what to do about it. I reached out and took the collar of her coat between my hands and settled it higher, the way you settle a thing that you intend to keep warm. My knuckles brushed the curve of her jaw. I did not move them away. She looked up at me from under the collar, and her eyes were the same as they had always been, steady, unafraid, seeing me entirely. Yes, she said. That was how it began. Not with a ceremony. Not with a court assembled or a pack summoned or a title announced in a torchlit hall. It began in a courtyard with a wolf breathing cloud into the cold air, and a woman in a damp traveling coat, and a king holding a collar against the wind. But there was a morning, some weeks after, when the pack of the north, the lords of the high settlements and the wolf keepers of the passes, the wardens of the mountain roads, gathered at Ironspire for the winter council. The first winter council I had attended in person in years. I had always sent Brennan with my seal. I had not trusted myself in a hall of eyes, not with Aldrich as he had been. Aldrich walked into that hall beside Senna. He walked in with his head up and his stride full and easy, the wolf I remembered from the years before grief. And the room noticed, the way a room notices when something long absent has returned. There was a moment of collective stillness, every lord and warden reading the great wolf's bearing and reading it correctly. Senna was beside me, wearing, at her insistence, her own clothes, a healer's good dress of dark green wool, well-made but not grand. She had declined the offerings of the court seamstress with characteristic practicality. She was a healer, not a Luna of ceremony, she said, and she would wear what she wore until she needed to wear something else. I had not argued with her. I had known her long enough by then to understand that her practicality was not modesty or false diminishment. It was simply her relationship to things. She used what was fit for purpose and had no interest in display. The silver mark was visible at her wrist. Every person in the hall saw it. Every person in that hall knew the mark. It was old lore, the bond mark of the Lycan line, the thing that completed only once in a king's life if he was fortunate. Most kings were not. They had thought I would not be after 7 years. Some of them had perhaps begun to accommodate themselves to a north without a bonded king, to the administrative reality of a line that might require a different kind of succession. I had known they thought this. I had not blamed them for it. It was reasonable. The Lord of the Eastern Pass was the first. He was old, older than anyone else in the hall, old enough to have attended my father's bonding ceremony when he was a young man, old enough to remember what it had looked like then, the mark visible on my father's wrist across a hall of firelight, and he rose from his seat and inclined his head deeply, the full bow of acknowledgement. Not a bow of performance or politics, a bow of recognition, the kind of bow that says, we see, We have waited. It is well. The warden of the northern pass followed, and the lord of the high settlement, and Brennan at the side wall who had quietly served this hold through 7 years of closed tower doors and early winter silence. And then all of them, one by one, until the hall was full of bowed heads and the quiet that follows when a room has found its answer. I looked at Senna. She was looking at the hall with an expression that was not triumph. She was not the kind of person who needed triumph, but something quieter, something like relief, the way you look when you have been walking a long way and you have arrived somewhere you had not known was home until you stood in it. I watched her take a slow breath, steady and full, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, not relaxing exactly, but settling, the way a person settles when they are done holding themselves against a wind they had not known they were bracing against. Aldrich sat between us and was entirely still, and entirely calm, and entirely himself. Castle's note arrived 2 days later. He congratulated us with his customary warmth and offered his services to the Northern Court in whatever capacity might be of use, and I read the note and set it aside with the particular calm of a man who no longer needs to be managed. Brennan burned it. I did not stop him. In the weeks that followed, the tower changed. Not in the way of grand renovation. It was still a tower, still cold, still given to drafts, and the particular acoustics that made the wind at midnight sound like a conversation in the next room. But Senna brought things from her traveling case by degrees. A small oil lamp of an unusual amber glass that threw warm light, a collection of pressed herbs pinned flat behind rough paper frames, 3 small river stones she had carried from Willowfen because she liked the shape of them. She put the river stones on the window ledge, and I moved them each time I opened the shutter, and moved them back each time I closed it, a negotiation we never discussed but both observed. Aldrich ran in the courtyard every morning now. He ran with a young wolf from the northern pass who had been sent to Ironspire as a ward, a shy and overly serious pup of 2 years named Oren, who had been frightened of Aldrich on arrival, and was now, inexplicably, convinced that Aldrich was his particular responsibility, trailing after him through the courtyard with the intense focus of someone who has been given a very important job and intends to do it well. Senna watched them from the window with the particular contained warmth of a person who does not easily show delight, but feels it deeply. I watched her. That was the thing I had not anticipated. Not the bond, though the bond was real and settled in me with an ease I had not expected, a rightness, a warmth behind the ribs that expanded outward. Not the quiet, though the quiet was the most precious thing I had been given. What I had not anticipated was the simple and surprising pleasure of watching a person be themselves in a space they had made their own. She moved through the tower with an unhurried certainty that was entirely her own. She had opinions about the placement of the cressets and the temperature of the hearth and the hour at which Aldrich ought to eat. She had, I discovered gradually, a very dry and quiet wit that she deployed rarely and with precision, and which consistently caught me entirely off guard. One evening, early in the deep winter, she looked up from the herb work she had brought to the fireside and said, "Lord Castle will try again. Something new, he always has something new." "He will," I agreed. "He is not malicious," she said, considering. "He is very certain that he knows what is best for everyone, and that certainty makes him reckless." "You read him exactly." She was quiet for a moment, turning a dried stem between her fingers. "He sent me north because he thought I would bind 2 courts to him. He was not wrong that I would come here and that something would change." A pause. "He was wrong about which thing?" "The thing that changed," I said, "was not a court arrangement." "No," she agreed, "it was not." Aldrich lifted his head from the hearthstone and regarded us both with the mild disinterest of a wolf who has known something for a long time and is patient about waiting for the people around him to arrive at it. "He knew first," I said. He always knows first, she said. That is the purpose of the bond. I thought about that. I thought about the first morning, and the exhaled breath, and the settling in my chest like a stone finding the floor of a deep river. 7 years, I said. She looked at me. 7 years of roaring in my own skull, I said, and in the moment you reached the landing it was quiet. I had not told her this before, not in these words, not as plainly as this. Not gone, not healed, just quiet. The way a storm is quiet when it passes. I did not know what to do with that, so I opened the door. She looked at me for a long moment. The fire was low between us, the amber lamp warm on the stone wall behind her. I heard it too, she said quietly, the silence. Like something settling. Like a stone, I said, finding the floor of a deep river. She considered this, the way she considered everything fully, without rushing. Then she said, I like that. I did not answer. There was nothing needed. The deep winter came in fully that night, and the mountain passes closed. An iron spire was islanded in snow, and I built the fire up higher than I usually allowed myself, and I sat on the floor of the tower room with my back against the stone wall and Aldrich sprawled across my legs, and Senna on the other side of him reading by the amber lamp. Oren, the young ward, had crept up the tower stairs at some point. I heard the faint complaint of the third step, the only one he had not yet learned to avoid, and had fallen asleep in the doorway, evidently planning to remain on watch, and having been defeated by warmth and a full supper. I could hear the snow against the high window, the particular sound of it, steady and soft. Senna turned a page. I thought, this is what it sounds like when a thing is whole. When spring opened the passes again, and the lords of the north began to come and go with the easy traffic of a thaw, they found Ironspire changed. They found the Lycan king receiving counsel in the lower hall, with Aldrich at his side and a healer from the border country at his right hand. They found the bond mark visible on them both. They found the tower no longer a sealed and brooding thing, but a place with a lamp burning in the high window and a young wolf in the courtyard, and an herb garden being established with ruthless practicality against the south-facing wall where the sun reached longest. They found, in other words, a hold that was alive again. Senna organized the herb garden herself, with the help of 2 young women from the settlement who had been cautiously curious since her arrival, and who, having been invited to observe her work with a wolf-bitten boy from the stables, had decided she was someone worth knowing. She drafted them into the garden project with the same calm authority she brought to everything, explaining with great precision what each plant required, and they listened with the particular attention of people who understand they are learning something real. I watched her from the courtyard wall and thought, she does not know she is a Luna, she knows she is herself. The two things are not in conflict, they are the same. Summer came, then another winter. Oren grew out of his shyness and became boisterous and then had to be taught, patiently and repeatedly, to be boisterous at appropriate times and quiet at appropriate times, a project Senna undertook with the same steady patience she brought to wolves and kings. Aldrich watched this project with evident approval and contributed to it by occasionally putting his large dark head in Oren's path when the boy was running where running was not appropriate, a technique that was wordless and entirely effective. I helped when asked and stepped back when not, which Senna told me was the correct approach, and which I was glad to know because it was also the only approach I had. I found in that second year that I had become a different kind of king than I had been before. Not better in all the ways I might have wished. I was still not a king who found ceremony easy, still not a king who could sit in a hall full of flattery and not count the exits, but different in the ways that mattered. I listened more carefully. I slept through the night. I walked through the hold in the mornings the way Aldrich walked, attending to what was in front of me, not bracing against the memory of loss or the anticipation of it. Senna had not done that to me, precisely. She had simply been present, consistently and without agenda, until I had found my way to it myself, which is perhaps the only way that kind of change ever truly takes. She noticed, I think. She did not comment on it. She was not the kind of person who marked growth with commentary. She simply moved alongside it, making space for what had arrived. That, too, I had not known how much I needed until I had it. A letter came from the south, not from Castle, whose influence I understood had narrowed somewhat after the events of the winter, but from the Alpha King himself, brief and warm, conveying that Calder Reach was in good health and that he was to be married in spring, to a woman of his own court who had been his true mate all along. He suspected, though it had taken him some time and a certain clarifying journey north to see it. He wished us both well with a genuine simplicity I was glad to receive. I showed the letter to Senna. She read it and smiled a small, quiet smile and said, "Good." "Good," I agreed. She handed the letter back and returned to the herbs. She was preparing for a sick wolf in the eastern settlement, unhurried, capable, entirely at home. I folded the letter and set it on the window ledge beside the 3 river stones from Willowfen, which were still there. I had long since stopped moving them when I opened the shutter. I had arranged myself around them, which was, I thought, the right order of things. That evening I stood at the tower window with Senna beside me, both of us looking out at the mountain range in the last light, the same mountain she had been looking at the morning she arrived. Aldrich was on the floor behind us, asleep, his breathing the slow and easy rhythm I had not heard for 7 years, and now could not imagine being without. She pulled her coat tighter, as she always did when the mountain air came in cold, that small and practical gesture. I reached out and settled the collar higher around her, as I always did, my hand resting a moment at the line of her jaw. She looked up at me. The world already knew what we were to each other. The north knew and the south knew, and the mountains were indifferent in the way of mountains, which is not the same as not knowing. The bond mark had said what needed saying. But some things are worth saying again, quietly in the last light of an evening, with a wolf asleep at your feet, and the snow coming in off the mountains. "I am glad you did not turn back," I said. She looked at the mountains for a moment. Then she said, "I knew where I was going." The snow came in, steady and soft, and we watched it together, and the tower held the warmth of the amber lamp, and Aldrich breathed. And that was enough, that was everything, that was the whole of it.